don't expand our imagination.
Justification for being what you are.
And welcome to Washington Unplugged. I'm Bob Orr. Well, we start again today with the ongoing oil spill crisis in the Gulf and BP's mounting problems. The company today is desperately again trying to stop the massive leak by cutting the damaged pipe and fitting the rig with a new containment cap, but there are snags again today. After last week's failure with Topkil, confidence at the least is lagging and the BP stock price is plummeting. And now BP is getting serious heat from the White House as we've learned that civil and criminal investigations have been launched into the oil spill. Let's bring in Chief Legal Analyst Jan Crawford, who's been following this. Jan, what does this mean when the Attorney General stands there and says, yes, we're going to investigate?
Well, obviously, the White House is trying to look tough and strong and showing, because obviously, as you know, they're coming under some intense criticism for being a little too close to BP, that they're taking this seriously. This is not unexpected. As we have all heard, the Justice Department several weeks ago asked these companies to preserve their documents. We knew an investigation was on the way, but some tough talk yesterday by the Attorney General, and now these companies are facing serious penalties.
Now, he made the point of saying civil investigation and, if warranted, a criminal investigation. What would move this into the criminal realm?
Depends on what kind of evidence they have. Now, the Attorney General yesterday mentioned several environmental statutes, and I think for context we can talk about the Exxon Valdez case. Exxon obviously was charged under some of those same environmental laws, Clean Water Act, Migratory Bird Act, and those are not as difficult to prove. I mean, the Migratory Bird Act, if you get oil from a spill on a migratory bird, you're guilty. But some of the other statutes that the Attorney General talked about yesterday, I think, is where BP could run into some real serious problems. Not that these wouldn't be serious. Remember, Exxon paid $1 billion to settle some of those claims. That's where we get into possible charges of obstruction of justice or fraud. Remember, several senators already have accused BP of making false statements. And if you lie to the government, you're in big trouble.
So you can't put a corporation in jail, but if you can prove, I guess, that an executive or somebody with knowledge, somebody with the planning, knowingly misled or was fraudulent or gave false statements, that person could face legal jeopardy.
Oh, absolutely. If anyone in these companies knowingly, just as you said, knowingly made false statements, that is a federal offense, and you could face serious penalties for that. That also opens yourself up to other fraud charges, like I said, like obstruction or conspiracy. So that's what the Attorney General and the Justice Department also is going to be looking at to see if BP intentionally misled federal regulators or other federal officials.
So the Attorney General is down there, and he essentially asserts a federal investigation and control over this. But what about all the states? I mean, couldn't the people of Louisiana file suit, and Florida and Mississippi?
That's a great question, and there are obviously so many states that are affected, including my own great state of Alabama. And again, I think we need to look back to the Exxon case in 1989. Obviously, that only involved one state, but there the government coordinated with those state officials. They almost really did a joint investigation to work out this kind of federal-state settlement against Exxon, as well as the lawsuits also were consolidated. So at the end of the day, Exxon ended up spending about $2 billion to settle all these claims, in addition to the cleanup costs, which of course will be separate and will be separate here for BP.
It could be huge here.
Oh my God! I mean, they're already. I think they've already spent what, $1 billion dollars.
Right.
Yeah.
Now the government's in kind of a tough spot here because on the one hand they're kind of saber rattling and saying we're going to hold your feet to the fire, but it's not like BP has to go away. They've got the expertise to fix this.
Yeah, and I mean, that's where it's difficult. It's an excellent point because they're really walking a fine line here. And we saw some Republicans yesterday start to criticize Holder for really being a little too forceful because while, you know, the U.S. government wants to go after BP and these other companies with the full force of the law, as Holder said, the Attorney General said, they also are relying on them to stop this leak and clean it up. So they're in this weird posture now of relying on them while they're antagonizing them.
And how long is this going to take? It seems to me like this could just drag out for a long time.
You mean the legal? I agree. It could take a very long time. I think that's impossible to decide. BP may decide to settle. I think it really depends on what kind of evidence that we have and the Justice Department ultimately finds out, what kind of charges they're going to be looking at, whether or not some of those false statements come into play, again, something that would put them on a different track entirely. Exxon was able to settle with the federal government pretty quickly. It only took a couple years to do the initial settlement. Of course, the issues of punitive damages and all that played out much longer. That took 20 years for the Supreme Court. court ultimately to resolve
Could be a
that
very
one.
costly investigation, too. I mean, you're talking about going back through a lot of paper, a lot of statements, what people said, what they knew, going back years.
Well, that's true. But what I think is going to be the most costly is what the impact on BP is going to be. And obviously trying to restore some livelihood to the people who've been so harmed by this. I mean, whose livelihoods are really going to be damaged. And, of course, tourism and all of those states, those beautiful beaches along the Gulf Coast and possibly into Florida.
Very sad. Jan Crawford, thanks.
Thanks, Bob.
Moving now to the fallout over Monday's flotilla raid near Gaza. Today, Israel has quickened the pace of expelling the detained pro-Palestinian activists as international outrage intensifies. But with at least one more ship and maybe two heading for Gaza's shores within the next few days, and Israel's promise to stop them, the crisis, in fact, could be escalating. CBS News national security analyst Juan Zarate and CBS News foreign affairs analyst Pamela Falk are joining me now to talk about this. Thanks to both of you for being here.
Thanks, Bob.
Juan,
Good to be here, Bob.
We'll start with you. This thing looks like it's kind of maybe spiraling towards a very bad ending.
I think this is a diplomatic mess of mammoth proportions for Israel. What you had was not only a bungled operation with respect to the handling of those flotillas, but really a bungling of the diplomatic aura and ambiance around this issue. What you have now is Israel under attack at the UN internationally, and in particular from Turkey, with all eyes focused on Israeli policies, not just, again, in this incident, but with respect to Gaza. And so Israel is feeling and seeming quite vulnerable. Its traditional allies, in particular Turkey, and now the U.S. Are on their heels. And in the case of Turkey, actually, Turkey's attacking in some ways diplomatically. And so this is quite an odd situation for Israel and quite a vulnerable situation for them. A situation that I think is not going to resolve itself quickly or easily.
Pam, what about the diplomatic fallout? I mean, the U.S. has been trying to walk a very careful line here, but the Turkish officials have been very upset, asking for the UN to do something. What is going on?
Well, the UN has been very active in this and had a 13-hour meeting on Memorial Day on this and came out with a unified statement that the United States did sign on to that basically left Israel's name out but said the use of force by the Israeli naval commandos resulted in life that should not have been taken. It also called on the international community to basically end the blockade, and that's also embodied in a UN resolution. Now, diplomatically, the U.S. has to deal with both the U.S.-Turkey relationship, including NATO, the Israel-Turkey relationship, and Turkey's been very vital in the Middle East peace talks. And so the U.S. does have George Mitchell now still trying to keep those proximity talks on, but the international community is very interested in an investigation, and that will be key. Who does the investigation? The Human Rights Commission is discussing this issue, and Israel would like to investigate it themselves.
Well, let me ask you this. Is either side satisfied with the U.S. response so far? I mean, the administration is in a tight spot, Israel being a longtime ally, but at the same time, the administration can't be seen as being anti-Arab here.
Absolutely. And the Obama administration, President Obama said very specifically he is looking for an international investigation that is not only Israeli. And that's something that's very sensitive to Israel. There was one last year that was called the Goldstone Report about the 2008-2009 conflict between Israel and Gaza. And Israel was very unhappy with the fact that that came out with war crimes on both sides, or at least some allegations. And they are trying to avoid that. That may very well happen. But what's really the mandate of the United States is to keep the talks going, and also to make sure that both Turkey and Egypt has opened some of the border crossings and trying to lift some of the blockade against Gaza, which is also what Israel is doing, to make sure that there is a balance of two issues. The first is that Israel does have a right to defend its blockade on the high seas and international waters, and then also has to be careful about disproportionate use of force. Israel will meet this issue again with another boat, as you mentioned, Bob, that's steaming toward the Gaza Strip. And so they have to deal with some way to deal with the peace humanitarian groups that really would like to break the blockade and return to a day pre-2007 when there wasn't a blockade of Gaza.
And there's also kind of a bigger issue here, too, Juan. Let's talk about the Turkey connection, because a lot of people don't quite get this, but the whole Iran nuclear issue and the Turks' involvement, explain that to me. Why is this really a critical point?
Well, there's been a growing rupture between Turkey and Israel, which have had long-time diplomatic ties, military ties. But there's been a growing rift between the two countries ever since Israel went into Gaza in 2008. That's where you saw the Prime Minister Erdogan for Turkey really take a hard line against Israel, take a leadership role diplomatically in denouncing Israeli actions. And in particular, after the Goldstone report talked about war crimes and human rights abuses, Turkey's really been on the forefront. There have been, in addition, some diplomatic spats between Turkey and Israel. We saw this between Shimon Peres and Prime Minister Erdogan in Davos, where the Prime Minister actually stepped off the stage, which led to recriminations on both sides. And so tension has been very high between these two former allies, and the Turks have been more and more vocal as critics of Israeli policy. Add to that now Turkey's role as a mediator with Iran, is seen by Israel as not a very helpful step in the mediation on the issue of Iranian nuclear policy, in part because Israel doesn't feel, and I think the United States feels this way as well with Turkey, that the deal negotiated by the Turks and the Brazilians with Iran really got to the crux of the problem, which is suspicion about what the Iranian nuclear program is really all about. And in some ways, I think the American administration, and certainly the Israelis, have been frustrated with Turkey's role with Iran. And some have seen Turkey sort of facing eastward, starting to make greater diplomatic inroads and ties with countries like Syria and Iran, with a policy of greater peace with their neighbors. I mean, it's really a different rubric. And so all of this is happening at a time where Turkish-Israeli relations are shifting dramatically. And to me, this is one of the fundamental issues to come from this event on the high seas. You really have what may be the ultimate rupture between Turkey and Israel, which changes the shape and complexion of relations in the Middle East. Because Turkey has played a moderate role here. They've tried to negotiate between Syria and Israel. They've been a friend to Israel. And now, with the loss of that potential ally to Israel, I think Israel is starting to feel more and more isolated and more vulnerable.
And, of course, the U.S. is in the middle of this, too. Pam, what is your sense of the U.S.-Turkish relationship right now?
Well, it's very important for it to be a very good relationship. Turkey is up for European Union membership. The United States can play a role in that. I think there are longer-term relationships that are continuing. Israel has arms sales that are pending. And so I think it will balance itself out in the end. But Turkey has to really deal with the fact that there are major protests in Islamabad. There are also major protests in the European Union. And they're all part of this Middle East quartet negotiations. I'm glad, Juan, you brought up the Iran issue. That's a complication as well, because Brazil and Turkey were the ones who were negotiating putting this UN-brokered deal back on, which was to export the enriched uranium from Iran. And this comes at a time when the IAEA has come out with a report that there is enough to make 2 nuclear weapons in Iran. That's on the heels of one last thing, and that is the Non-Proliferation Treaty negotiations that just ended, calling for a nuclear-free Middle East. So Israel's under a lot of pressure. This was a public issue and public perception nightmare, and they've got to get it all back on track. I think the accumulation of all these things is a real problem for Israel, but I think in the end, Turkey has some vested interest in getting it back on track, as does Egypt, as does the United States.
And finally, Pam, just quickly, what should we look for now from the UN? What do you expect to happen there? What should we be watching for?
Number one, to watch for the Human Rights Council, which is a UN vested body, and that is the new Human Rights Council that the United States is now a member of. They will be looking for a new an international investigation that is likely to condemn Israel, or at least from what you look at the 47-member body, it will. There's also going to be a call for a stronger statement than the presidential statement, perhaps a UN resolution, which of course the United States would be likely to veto, but it still will be in play in terms of the use of force and disproportionate use of force. So the UN will be at the forefront of these negotiations. The UN can also be a resolution leader in terms of the delivery of humanitarian aid. The UN relief agencies are the principal relief agencies that Israel uses to deliver this aid. So the UN is going to be in the forefront. There have been criticism by the UNSG, Ban Ki-moon, about this. And I think going forward, everyone's going to be walking on eggshells to make sure that Israel's self-defense is guaranteed, but there's something better moving forward.
And Juan, we'll give you the last word here. Does the administration need to come out in some stronger way? Because right now, doesn't it run the risk of being caught as almost too passive, too much in the middle?
Well, it's walking the tightrope that you described earlier and that Pam discussed. It has to obviously condemn what appears to be the use of violence, the death of innocents on these flotillas. This is terrible because these are individuals who are delivering humanitarian aid amidst this political dispute about what to do with Gaza and the Hamas-run controlled territory. But the administration also has to defend its ally and can't be perceived to be backing too far away from a defense of Israel at a time in particular when Israel is feeling more and more vulnerable, and at a time when the U.S. has vested interest in being able to influence Israel. You have the peace process, you have the situation in Gaza, you have relations with Turkey, and importantly, you've got all of the issues surrounding Iran, to include trying to dissuade, if we get to this point, an Israeli strike against Iranian nuclear facilities. All of which is looming in the background here and which needs to be taken into consideration. All right, Juan Zarate, thanks for joining us. And Pam Falk, thanks for joining us from the UN. A good discussion. And we are not done with that discussion by a long shot. That is it for today on Washington Unplugged. Join us here every day on CBSNews.com. I'm Bob Orr. Have a good day.